In the Montana Territory, Frostpine Hollow, in the fall of 1887, the atmosphere in the small valley was thick with simmering tension as residents busily prepared for a winter forecast to be the harshest in 3 decades. Amid that scene, the three-year-old widow Eleanor Hart quietly rebuilt her new cabin after the old one had been destroyed by a spring storm. A woman raising 2 young children alone and building the cabin with her own hands was already enough to set the whole community buzzing. But what truly made them suspicious and uneasy was Eleanor's choice to place her fireplace deep in the northwest corner. Angled completely away from the traditional wall axis, they considered the unchangeable standard of the Montana region. To the people of Frostpine Hollow, it was not just an odd decision, but an act that challenged the experience of generations of frontier men. Caleb Myron, a veteran builder with 30 years of experience, stood in the common yard, shaking his head in dismay and passing judgment. Corner fireplaces only exist in European books. In Montana, the wind will kill her before it warms her. Others bluntly predicted that Eleanor's cabin would be the first to fall when the north wind swept down, that her fireplace would go out on the very first storm night. They did not believe a widow could understand what the entire town had accepted as truth for years. In just a few weeks, those who were mocking her would have to look at themselves, because Eleanor Hart was the only one in the valley who truly understood how the wind blew, how stone held heat, and what determined survival in the brutal winter about to descend. Late fall, 1887 inches, the Montana Territory was a time when Eleanor Hart was struggling both with her grief and with holding on to whatever she could for her 2 children. Isaac Hart, her husband, had died at the end of the previous winter before he could rebuild the family home. But he left behind a thick notebook of nearly 140 pages, stained with smoke and lamp oil, detailing dozens of fireplace experiments he had tried or observed while working for European immigrant groups. It included sketches of Scottish Highlands hearths, Bernese Alps, Alpine stoves, and notes Isaac had copied from German stonemasons who had migrated to Montana. He believed that Montana's climate, especially in the mountain range near Frostpine Hollow, was similar to that of Europe's mountainous regions in both wind patterns and the temperature swings between day and night. Eleanor had no technical building knowledge like Isaac, but she had a careful, patient nature and a remarkably sharp memory. When Isaac was gone, she opened the notebook again, reading every line with the focus of someone who had to understand in order to survive, not out of curiosity. Isaac had written, "A mid-wall fireplace suits low winds, but when wind pours down from the mountaintop, pressure slams straight into the chimney." That sentence made Eleanor pause longer. Frostpine Hollow lay right at the mouth of a narrow valley, where north winds arrived strongly like a cascading waterfall, easily causing downdraft. So Eleanor decided to try the design Isaac called the corner draft hearth, placing the fireplace deep in the cabin's northwest corner, where wind traveling along both walls would create a natural low-pressure pocket that Isaac described as the wind pocket effect. When she began building, she selected stones according to Isaac's guidance, dividing them into 3 groups by density and moisture absorption. The core mass stone group consisted of slabs weighing 130 pounds each, with a density of about 175 pounds per cubic foot, able to withstand thermal shock from 32 degrees Fahrenheit to 900 degrees Fahrenheit without cracking. The outer shield stone had lower density, around 150 pounds per cubic foot, strong under pressure but slow to conduct heat, used as an insulating layer. The vent stone was the lightest, used to create small air channels at the bottom of the firebox. Eleanor gathered a total of about 4,000 pounds of stone for the heat storage mass in the corner alone. This mass measured roughly 48 inches wide, 54 inches high, and 32 inches deep, assembled from 19 large stones and more than 30 medium ones, all hand-chiseled to interlock like puzzle pieces. This was the stone mass chamber, the heart of the fireplace. The second layer was the reflective, angled firebox, the firebox that Isaac recommended angling 15-20 degrees to reflect radiant heat in a fan pattern. Eleanor remeasured the cabin and chose 17 degrees, just enough so the heat would not shoot straight up the chimney but sweep out into the 4-foot-wide cabin. The firebox was built with 2 layers of stone, an inner 3-inch heat-resistant layer and an outer 5-inch crack-resistant layer. The firebox opening was 22 inches wide and 18 inches high, smaller than traditional fireboxes but optimized for long-burning cycles. The third layer was the corner chimney draft, a chimney offset 12 degrees toward the northeast, about 9 feet tall from the firebox to the top, with a 9-inch diameter. Isaac had noted that a corner chimney should follow the low-pressure intersection axis between the two walls, where wind running along the cabin would create a stable draft, not reversed like chimneys on frontal walls. Eleanor did not fully understand the mechanism, but when she held her hand there, she felt a gentle, steady upward airflow without swirling. That was the sign Isaac had told her to look for. As the fireplace took shape, the engineering principles became clear. The west and north cabin walls both received heat, totaling 16 feet each. This was double the heat exchange surface of a mid-wall fireplace, which only heated one wall. When the stone mass reached 400 to 600 degrees Fahrenheit, it acted like a thermal battery, holding heat for 10-12 hours instead of the 3-4 hours of traditional fireplaces. But no one in Frostpine Hollow paid attention to those numbers. They only saw a widow doing something contrary to frontier common sense, something the men in the area believed they alone possessed. Caleb Myron passed by, glanced at the offset chimney, and declared, "Women don't understand the north wind." That statement spread quickly through town like a confirmation. Miriam Walker told her neighbors, "She won't listen to men. That's a disaster." And Silas Bowman laughed that evening in true frontier American style. The frontier ain't a place for experiments. The skepticism was not just from gender bias. It stemmed from fear of being proven wrong. They had built fireplaces the same way for 40 years, and no one wanted to accept that a woman might see what they had missed. But in that crowd, there was one pair of eyes watching differently. Old Henrik, the solitary Norwegian hunter living near the forest edge. He stopped for a long time in front of Eleanor's corner fireplace. When he saw the 17 degrees angle and the diagonal chimney, he paused, as if a distant memory had been awakened. He had once seen a nearly identical design in Trondheim in his youth, a Hjørnepeis, a Nordic corner fireplace that used the cold outdoor wind to stabilize the draft. But Henrik said nothing. He just nodded slightly and walked on. Meanwhile, Eleanor poured her strength into the work. It took her a total of 18 days to build the fireplace, 4 times longer than a typical crew would need for a 6-foot mid-wall fireplace. She sealed every air gap with a clay and ash mixture, ground each stone flat to minimize heat loss, and rechecked the chimney angle using Isaac's plumb line, the only thing of his that remained intact after the storm that destroyed the old cabin. When the first test fire was lit, the smoke rose straight and steady, with no backdraft as Caleb had predicted. The heat output was not intense but spread evenly throughout the cabin, without creating hot spots near the firebox like mid-wall designs. Eleanor watched the stone mass warm gradually from bottom to top, exactly as Isaac had described. That was the sign of a system operating on correct principles. Yet the community remained firmly convinced she was being foolish. "It'll collapse soon enough," they told each other. "One north wind night will do it." Eleanor did not respond. She just placed her hand on the still warm stone. In the red firelight reflecting off the stones, she had no idea that the very corner fireplace the whole valley was mocking would become the thing that saved the entire community's lives in the merciless winter approaching hour by hour. In early November, the air in Frostpine Hollow began to change. Nighttime temperatures dropped to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, a mild cold for Montana, enough to form a thin frost on cabin roofs and make the wind threading through the trees sound sharper. For most valley residents, this was just the usual sign that winter was nearing. But for Eleanor, it was the moment to test the design the whole town was ridiculing. On the first morning, reaching 20 degrees Fahrenheit, she opened the window to check and found the glass still clear, with no frost. This was completely opposite her neighbors' cabins. Caleb's windows were fogged, and Silas's even had a thin, wet ice layer inside the wooden frames. Many children had to warm their hands by the fire from dawn. Eleanor relit the morning fire and carefully noted in Isaac's notebook. Day 1. Temperature 7 hours after fire out, 49 degrees Fahrenheit. The next day, at similar cold, the cabin maintained 51-53 degrees Fahrenheit. For 3 consecutive nights, it stayed warm enough without adding wood after 10 p.m. She checked the stone mass chamber and found the stones still holding even warmth from base to near the top, exactly as Isaac had described in his notes. Meanwhile, In the Myron cabin, the temperature dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit just 2-3 hours after the fire died. Caleb grumbled irritably to Silas that this year's north wind was more troublesome than usual, but still refused to acknowledge the results at Eleanor's cabin. On the fourth day, old Henrik stopped by this time, not watching from afar, but walking straight to the corner where the chimney rose under the roof. He observed how the smoke rose, not in thick plumes, not swirling, not wavering in the wind. Then he asked quietly, getting right to the point, "Have you noticed the north wind circling along the roof?" Eleanor paused for a moment and nodded. Over the previous 2 nights, she had heard the wind gliding along the roof, not slamming directly into the cabin walls. Henrik just smiled faintly, the smile of someone who had seen this technique in his youth in Norway, but he said nothing more. The 5th night marked the most critical test. Unusually strong winds, gusting 25-30 miles per hour down from the mountainside. This was the kind of wind that caused problems for many frontier cabins, especially downdraft, where wind reversed into the chimney, filling the house with smoke and extinguishing the fire. As expected, 5 cabins in the valley had issues that same night. The Bowman house had to throw open the doors because smoke could not escape, leaving the children coughing. The Walker fire went out after midnight, with temperatures dropping to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Caleb suffered such strong downdraft that embers scattered onto the floor, nearly causing a fire. But in Eleanor's cabin, the fire burned steadily. Smoke rose straight, with no reversal, despite winds strong enough to rattle the back door. This happened because of the wind pocket effect Isaac had repeatedly mentioned. Wind running along the west and north walls created a low-pressure zone in the corner, maintaining steady chimney draft. Instead of fighting the wind like mid-wall designs, the corner fireplace used the strong airflow as assistance. Yet, despite the clear results right in front of them, the community refused to change their view. When asked, Silas just waved it off. Wait for the real storm. When Montana winter hits, nothing will hold. Caleb insisted. One lucky night proves nothing. Wait until the wind from Canada comes down. To them, early season signs were just a minor game before the real battle. They believed the classic design was the one proven across generations. They believed Eleanor's corner fireplace would inevitably fail with just one stronger wind night. But what they did not know and could not foresee was that the challenge awaiting them was not an ordinary blizzard. A historic cold wave was forming from the north, about to sweep down on Frostpine Hollow, more merciless than any winter the valley had ever seen. In the days that followed, Frostpine Hollow began showing signs that only longtime frontier residents could sense. Atmospheric pressure dropped rapidly. People here had no barometers like in larger towns, but their bodies understood the change before the sky even shifted color. Many complained of chest heaviness, as if an invisible fog pressed down on them. Animals grew strangely restless. Cattle clustered together instead of grazing apart. Horses stamped continuously in their stalls. Chickens stopped crowing in the morning. Winds came in intermittent bursts, not the steady flow of normal winter, but sharp gusts that struck hard, then stopped abruptly, as if the entire valley were being squeezed by a giant hand and then released. Migratory birds flew low to the ground, their paths veering sharply south. Dogs throughout the valley barked in unison toward the north, a bad omen always heeded on the frontier. It was in that context that Edgar Millen, the old mail carrier who had ridden this route for over 40 years, trudged in thick mud-caked boots to Eleanor's cabin. He was one of the few in the area with memory long enough to connect scattered signs into a clear picture. Edgar took a deep breath and said to Eleanor, in a quiet but firm voice, "No moisture in the wind. It's the same wind as the year we buried 4 people in 2 weeks." The statement was not a threat. It was simply an unavoidable truth. Edgar looked at Eleanor's cabin for a long time, not at the roof, walls, or fireplace, but at the whole structure, as if assessing whether it could withstand what was coming. Finally, he said one thing that left Eleanor speechless. "If anyone survives the winter ahead, it might be you." Then he turned and walked away, his small figure blending into the thick gray sky, lowering gradually. But the rest of the Frostpine Hollow community paid no attention to that warning. They trusted their own experience, and the patterns repeated across generations, even though this winter was already showing far too many unusual signs. Caleb Myron still smirked when meeting Silas in the common yard. Any fireplace gives heat. This winter will just prove women shouldn't touch building. That line was repeated often in afternoon conversations until it became the default conclusion. Miriam Walker even believed these anomalies were God's punishment simply because Eleanor dared defy men's tradition, dared place the fireplace in what she called a position against nature. Those rumors spread through the valley faster than the wind. But in the small cabin at the forest edge, Eleanor let none of it affect her preparations. She resealed air gaps with strips of old cloth soaked in clay mixture, a technique Isaac had taught to minimize heat loss through wood seams. She inspected every stone joint in the corner fireplace, running her hand over each to feel for vibration or instability, checking if any needed replacing. She rearranged the firewood stock in the exact slow-burn layering layout, stacking in alternating thick and thin layers to extend burn time and stabilize heat for many hours. Those details meant nothing to anyone else in the valley, but Eleanor knew the difference between life and death could lie in a single stone joint off by half an inch. Her two children, Clara and Jonah, helped their mother. Clara gathered small kindling for quick starts. Jonah pushed large baskets of wood close to the wall to avoid floor moisture. The lamplight shone on the three of them, creating a scene in complete contrast to the mockery outside. No resentment, no panic, just quiet but determined preparation. Outside, the wind gradually shifted to a low howl, no longer the sharp whistle of earlier in the week. That was the sound Frontier people always feared, the sound signaling something far greater approaching. Eleanor stood by the door, clutching her thin wool shawl. And though she did not say it, she sensed this winter would be unlike any before. But she had no idea that these unusual signs were merely the prelude. What was forming in the north, the thing coiling like a massive beast behind the cold mountains, would be more merciless than any winter Frostpine Hollow had ever witnessed. The first storm night hit Frostpine Hollow so fast that no one had time to prepare anything more. Arctic wind swept through the valley like a razor-sharp blade of cold slashing down from the mountain rim, with temperatures plummeting nearly 30 degrees Fahrenheit in just a few hours. By midnight, the entire valley had dropped to a level of cold the oldest residents hadn't seen in 20 years, negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and it kept falling lower. What caused the most panic wasn't the howling wind, but the sight of ice forming right inside many cabins, a phenomenon modern American audiences might struggle to imagine. But in Frontier reality, it was the sign of a merciless winter about to crush everything. Wooden walls contracted rapidly, widening air gaps. Children's breath froze into thick white frost. Floorboards cracked in fine lines from the sudden temperature shift. By the third day, the first heating systems in the valley began to collapse. The Walker house suffered such strong downdraft that smoke poured straight into the interior, forcing them to throw open both doors for the smoke to escape, dropping the indoor temperature to just 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Children coughed violently, tears and snot freezing into white streaks on their cheeks. In the Bowman cabin, bricks around the firebox cracked from thermal shock, splitting into two large pieces. Flames spurted out, then died, leaving the living room pitch black and freezing. Silas Bowman swore he had never seen wind strong enough to crack a fireplace in a single night. And in the Myron cabin, where Caleb had once boasted about his 30 years of skill, the fire went out 3 times in one night. Each time he relit it, wind reversed down the chimney, choking the flames, sending ash flying everywhere like a bitter reminder that the structure he believed was the eternal standard was failing completely. By the 5th day, despair spread through the valley. Many homes started burning furniture, chairs, bed legs, bookshelves, anything that could burn to hold on to a bit of warmth. Water in buckets near the fire froze solid despite being only steps away. Windows were coated in thick ice crystals, making it hard to see outside. Wind hammered the walls like a sledgehammer, each blow as if trying to bend the entire cabin frame. Silas Bowman had to bring his 2 cows and 7 sheep inside for extra warmth, an absurd but utterly real scene in Frontier desperation. The breath of livestock mixed with human breath, creating a thick fog that made the cabin constantly hazy, shrouded in smoke and mist. The sound of children crying from cold, women groaning from aching joints, men growling in helplessness, all formed a noise that anyone who experienced it would want to forget. And then, amid those scenes of desperation, Eleanor's cabin stood out like a cinematic contrast. Her corner fireplace burned steadily, flames sweeping evenly along the cabin walls before warmth spread throughout the room. The heat-storing stone mass reflected a gentle orange-red glow, Not glaring, but enduring. The kind of light that could reassure someone shivering just by looking at it. Eleanor's two children, Clara and Jonah, slept deeply under thick blankets, breathing evenly with no signs of cold shock. Indoor temperature held at 48-52 degrees Fahrenheit all night, a warmth completely opposite the 20-30 degrees Fahrenheit in most valley cabins. The wind outside still roared as if trying to tear Frostpine Hollow apart, but inside Eleanor's small cabin, warmth was preserved as if that corner fireplace was fighting the entire winter for her. People outside did not know this was only the 5th day of an 18-day historic freeze, and the harshest part of the winter had not even begun. On the 6th day of the freeze, when the valley was exhausted from the cold, Eleanor began recording temperatures more regularly, using Isaac's old mercury thermometer, one of the few items of his that survived the spring cabin collapse intact. She placed it at 3 different spots in the house: 6 feet from the fireplace, in the opposite corner, and right by the window. The results made even her pause for a few seconds. The Hart cabin maintained 52-58 degrees Fahrenheit, even though the fire had been out for 6-7 hours. Meanwhile, rumors from neighbors reaching her ears highlighted the terrifying gap. The Walker cabin registered 30 degrees Fahrenheit inside. Caleb's was down to 28-32 degrees Fahrenheit, more than 22 degrees Fahrenheit lower than Eleanor's. This was no longer a small difference or temporary luck. It was how a properly designed system stood firm against a winter crushing every old standard. Years later, energy engineers confirmed that the stone mass chamber, the 4,000-pound stone block in the corner, was the key to the miracle. On those nights, the stone mass reached a stable 140 degrees Fahrenheit, then radiated heat steadily for 12 continuous hours. There was no hot near the fire, cold, faraway phenomenon like in mid-wall cabins. The reason lay in the mechanism Isaac described in his notebook, and Eleanor applied instinctively. Heat concentrated in the corner, then spread along 2 thick perpendicular walls. When both walls absorbed heat, they retained warmth and gradually released it into the cabin air, creating stability the other homes completely lacked. Meanwhile, the chimney offset 12 degrees northeast proved its critical value. While Caleb's and Silas's chimneys suffered constant downdraft, strong north wind reversing down, filling homes with smoke, Eleanor's had steady, sustained draft. Wind running along the roof and walls created a low-pressure zone right at the corner fireplace, continuously pulling hot air up without trapping it. The fire thus burned steadily, without flickering or choking. While other cabins despaired over quickly dying embers, Eleanor only needed to relight in the morning. From the previous evening to dawn, the cabin held stable warmth. And right in that data-filled context, a touching everyday scene emerged as a necessary highlight to better see what was happening. One evening, as Eleanor rechecked temperature near the door, Clara, still wrapped in her mother's old wool blanket, looked out the window and asked, "Why are the other houses so cold, Mom?" The simple question hit Eleanor like a stone in the chest. She pulled her daughter close, hugged her, and answered softly, "It's not because they're bad, honey, but because they trusted what they were used to." It wasn't blame. It was frontier truth. Sometimes lifelong experience blocks people from seeing new dangers. But what Eleanor didn't expect was that those who had mocked her were starting to notice. On the strongest wind nights, when the valley drowned in piercing cold howls, a few people, at first just Caleb, then Silas and others, stood outside her cabin at midnight, not to ask for help, not yet ready to admit mistake. They just stood silently, feeling what their cabins lacked. A faint but real warm breeze escaping through door and window cracks. A quiet testament to the corner fireplace's efficiency. Some held hands to the gaps, and feeling heat radiate out while outside. The wind was still negative, 25 degrees Fahrenheit. They said nothing, just exchanged looks of confusion and bewilderment. They couldn't understand why a corner fireplace they had called a widow's folly stood firm against a storm their experience was powerless against. But it was only the beginning. Because Eleanor's cabin's superior performance wasn't just a temperature difference. It signaled the old community system in Frostpine Hollow collapsing, and they still didn't know the worst cold nights lay ahead. By the 8th day of the freeze, when outdoor temperature dropped to negative 28 degrees Fahrenheit and north wind pounded cabin walls like endless hammering, the first to break was Miriam Walker. Near midnight, Eleanor heard desperate knocking, not angry pounding, but trembling, Desperate knocks from someone on the edge of survival. Opening the door, she saw Miriam standing there, shoulders wrapped in a wool shawl, stiff from ice, fingers purple, lips pale. Behind her, a 6-year-old granddaughter shivering violently, breath so thin it seemed about to stop. Miriam no longer held her usual stern demeanor. She could only manage broken words. "Eleanor, I was wrong. Let us stay. Just one night." There was no resentment in Eleanor's eyes, only the resolve of someone who knew human lives mattered more than pride. She pulled the grandmother and child inside, closed the door, and wrapped extra blankets around the girl. Less than an hour later, as wind grew stronger, Eleanor heard heavy footsteps in the yard, this time Caleb Myron. The man who had once stood in the common yard mocking her that women don't understand the north wind now stood at her cabin door in a state no one could call proud. His beard was crusted white with frost, hands clutching a soaked, stiff fur hat, breath short from cold. He opened his mouth several times before words came. "My cabin can't hold warmth anymore." That statement, from the man who saw himself as the valley's most reliable builder, weighed more than any apology. Eleanor nodded lightly and invited him in, without mentioning the past. By dawn, Eleanor's cabin held 11 people. Children from neighboring cabins, the Walker couple, Caleb, and a single man purple-faced from wind. The small cabin was so warm most had to remove outer layers. Temperature held steady at 51–54 degrees Fahrenheit, despite wind outside still raging as if to rip Frostpine Hollow apart. Human body heat, as Isaac had briefly noted in his notebook, is a silent heat source, and now it proved hauntingly true. The more people sheltered, the better the stone mass chamber retained heat. Those who had mocked Eleanor now sat silently close to the cornerstones, hands stretched out to feel radiating warmth. No one spoke. No one had the face to. Only sighs of relief as warmth returned after days of skin torn by cold. Clara timidly offered the Walker child a cup of warm water. The child burst into sobs upon touching it to her lips, her body finally feeling what could be called safe. That moment quieted the room. Caleb sat against the wall, hands covering his face for a long time before muttering, more to himself than anyone. "We thought she was crazy, but we were technically blind." His voice held no self-defense. It was the shattering of pride worn by age, now completely crushed by reality. Eleanor looked at him. Without anger or sarcasm, she only replied softly, calm but firm. "As long as everyone lives." Outside, the storm still howled in the dark, but inside that small cabin, once called the stupid corner fireplace by the whole community, warmth spread evenly, as if standing on the line between life and death, fighting the winter for the very people who had doubted it most. As the 9th night passed and those sheltering in Eleanor's cabin gradually regained strength, what amazed them most wasn't just the warmth, but its near-absurd stability. A stability no mid-wall cabin in the valley could replicate. To explain it, even the freezing people sitting by the stone mass chamber began to clearly see the principles Isaac had described and Eleanor had instinctively recreated. First, thermodynamics. The 4,000-pound stone block placed in the cabin corner acted as a thermal battery, a passive but extremely efficient energy store. While mid-wall fireplaces transferred heat directly, then lost it almost immediately when flames died, the stone mass chamber retained heat and released it gradually over 10–12 hours. Thanks to high mass and density, it stored 2.3 times more energy than a typical fireplace wall with the same firewood. Whenever the storm blew hard, instead of wind sucking heat away, the stone wall radiated steady warmth, keeping cabin space nearly unchanged. Next, airflow draft and airflow, the life or death difference between Eleanor's cabin and struggling mid-wall ones outside. Because the fireplace sat deep in the northwest corner, where two walls created a natural low-pressure zone, hot air from the firebox rose steadily up the chimney without sideways gusts or reversal. North wind, instead of hitting the smoke intake directly like in other cabins, slid along the cabin surface, circled the roof, then dissipated, creating no resistance. That was why Walker, Bowman, and Myron cabins all suffered downdraft, while Eleanor's did not. The wind's inability to reach the intake made Eleanor's draft nearly immune to storms, a concept seemingly counter to frontier instinct that strong wind was always the chimney's enemy. But the key factor was the internal convection cycle. Unlike mid-wall fireplaces radiating heat in one direction and creating a hot zone right by the fire, the corner design allowed heat to spread in a U shape, from the corner mass into the north wall, along the west wall, then out into the cabin center. Thus, heat didn't concentrate in one spot but distributed evenly, warming the whole room slowly but lastingly. Anyone who lived in log homes in winter knows a hot zone can feel warm for minutes but leaves the rest colder. Eleanor's fireplace avoided that mistake. It kept every part of the cabin in a continuous, hard-to-break heat cycle. When Henrik witnessed this, he nodded quietly because it closely resembled old European heating systems. Alpine corner stoves were built with the same philosophy, placing the firebox in the corner to shield it from valley-down winds. Norwegian Hjørnepeiser used double walls for stable draft, and German masonry heaters used large stone masses for hours-long heat storage. But what amazed Henrik was that Eleanor had no training, no instruction in those techniques. She only read Isaac's unfinished notes, then with a frontier woman's intuition honed by years with wind and stone, pieced together the logic to build a near-perfect system. That deeply touched the American psyche, seeing the frontier as a symbol of independence and self-reliance. A widow, mocked by the whole community, was the only one who truly understood nature's workings. Someone without building experience by male standards, yet who knew how to read wind, listen to stone, and arrange heat by practical logic better than any veteran builder. It was American individualism in its purest form. No need for power or title, just observation, reason, and the strength to stand against prejudice to find a survival path the community couldn't see. And that was when those inside Eleanor's cabin first understood not luck, but sitting beside a correct design created by someone they had refused to listen to before. When the 18-day freeze finally eased, Frostpine Hollow emerged from winter's shadow with the numb face of a community that had survived an event greater than any memory they held. Thick snow still blanketed the ground, but on its surface were clear traces of a devastating winter. 4 cabins completely lost, roofs torn off, walls collapsed, some shifted off foundations by wind, 11 livestock dead from cold or exhaustion, and 3 families nearly losing members when fires died on the worst storm night. Those numbers not only reflected nature's brutality but exposed the fragility of the system the whole valley had trusted as infallible standard. Meanwhile, Eleanor's cabin stood intact, as if winter had merely passed without touching it. Word of the corner fireplace's effectiveness spread quickly, and those who had mocked Eleanor now walked around her cabin with eyes mixed with awe and gratitude. But the most memorable image came not from words but Caleb Myron's actions. One morning, as snow on his roof had barely melted, Caleb brought a sledgehammer to his front yard. Without warning, he smashed his own fireplace, the one he had proudly called True Frontier, and used to ridicule Eleanor. The dry crack of breaking stone echoed through the quiet valley. Each blow was an admission. As people gathered, Caleb only said one thing, voice low but clear. I put my faith in the wrong place. It was a symbolic moment marking the collapse of old pride and the start of new thinking in the valley. Afterward, Caleb was the first to ask Eleanor to guide him in rebuilding his fireplace from scratch. And he wasn't alone. Within 2 days, 11 more men stood outside her cabin, not to doubt or mock, but to learn. Thus, an rare scene unfolded in a frontier community. Eleanor standing before 12 men, those who had called her reckless, explaining each step of the corner fireplace structure. She detailed stone mass classification, finding the low pressure point in the corner, measuring the firebox angle, and offsetting the chimney 12 degrees to avoid downdraft. No one interrupted. No one objected. They listened like students before a teacher. Silas Bowman, who had laughed loudest at Eleanor, now leaned close to his notes, hands trembling for fear of missing details. He kept asking, "Here, is it 5-inch or 6-inch stone facing? How many degrees offset is optimal in strong north wind? What's the distance from firebox to mass chamber for even heat spread?" Those questions no longer carried doubt but complete recognition. The scene a widow explaining technique to frontier men was something the valley had never seen, and it marked a profound social shift. For the first time, women in Frostpine Hollow were not just firekeepers but fire understanders. No one called Eleanor stubborn widow anymore. They called her frontier engineer, a title of few words but heavy as the cornerstone she built. The spread didn't stop there. Just a week later, Families from Timberline Ridge, nearly 12 miles away, heard of the cabin 22 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in the historic storm, and came to learn the corner fireplace model. Then people from Snowmelt Creek and Bearstone Valley arrived too. Each group left with rough sketches Eleanor drew on paper, some even borrowing Isaac's notebook to copy notes. In less than a month, the technique the valley had ridiculed spread to 3 neighboring valleys, becoming the passed-down formula of northern Montana mountains. From one small cabin corner once deemed foolish, Eleanor's design became survival for dozens of families, and the turning point forcing Frostpine Hollow to rethink beliefs built over generations. In the early 1982, when the story of widow Eleanor Hart's corner fireplace was revisited by Montana historians at a frontier architecture conference, a team of thermal engineers from Montana State University decided to verify whether the design created by an untrained woman in 1887 was truly superior, as local legend claimed. In 1981, they built an exact replica of Eleanor's corner fireplace using original materials: 4,000 pounds of sandstone, mortar mixed in clay-sand ratios based on archaeological samples from Frostpine Hollow, 17 degrees angled firebox, chimney offset in the wind pocket between 7-inch and 9-inch walls. Everything was recreated in a test chamber cooled to -20 degrees Fahrenheit to simulate the Arctic storm conditions Frostpine Hollow endured. As testing began, researchers monitored temperature differences at 12 points in the simulated cabin, heat retention time, and wood consumption per burn. Results stunned them. Thermal efficiency reached 2.6 times higher than traditional midwall fireplaces built to frontier standards of the era. Indoor temperature held for 10 to 14 hours after complete flameout, while the standard system lasted only 3 to 4 hours. Wood consumption dropped 38% to 42% while maintaining higher average temperature. One researcher wrote in the summary report, voice almost disbelieving the data. If widely adopted in the late 19th century, thousands of frontier families would have saved wood and avoided cold-related deaths. That assessment forced the team to rethink all assumptions about primitive frontier techniques. It turned out what Frostpine Hollow had mocked, as the stupid corner fireplace, shared physics foundations with modern principles. Thermal mass of passive houses where thick stone walls and heat-absorbing materials are core, masonry heaters, European stoves famous for long heat storage, and efficient Nordic corner stoves designs optimizing airflow via angles. The engineers realized Eleanor hadn't invented new laws. She had simply seen through intuition and Isaac Hart's unfinished notes, an old truth existing for centuries, then applied it perfectly to Montana's climate. For contemporary American audiences, the story became powerful proof of traditional knowledge's value. Not everything called old is outdated. Old knowledge matters. It always has. By the late 20th century, as researchers and tourists began visiting Frostpine Hollow to trace frontier survival stories, Eleanor Hart's cabin, still standing after nearly a century of blizzards, north winds, and Montana winters, was added to the Montana Heritage Trail Preservation List in 1976. The famous cornerstone mass was kept fully intact without excessive restoration, so future generations could see firsthand the technique a widow once called foolish used to save the valley. In front of the cabin, a brass plaque was erected with a short but history-packed line. She placed her fire in a corner and warmed a valley. Visitors often stood silently before those words, as if trying to picture the day Eleanor lit the first fire in the corner fireplace the community had ridiculed. Decades after that fateful 1887 winter, Eleanor's daughter Clara Hart wrote in her memoir, "My mother was just a small woman, but she understood wind and survival better than all the men who ever mocked her." That line became inseparable from mentions of Eleanor's legacy, a legacy not in cabin size, but in how she saw the world, unafraid of difference, unafraid of ridicule, trusting only what observation and experience demanded. In many studies, modern engineers often say ideas dismissed as foolish aren't wrong, they're just ahead of their time. And Eleanor's story proves that clearer than any scientific work. Innovation is not always new, sometimes it's something we once knew, rediscovered at the right moment. As the camera pulls back in the closing imagined shot, Eleanor's small cabin stands in the vast snowy valley, roof lightly frosted, the cornerstone still holding warm color under early winter morning sun. No people, only the quiet of wind and what it once taught a brave widow. The narrator's voice softly concludes, like the final word of a timeless story. One corner fireplace changed an entire valley, and one widow proved that survival wisdom knows no gender. If you appreciate historical stories full of value and survival wisdom like this, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.